I always am glad to come to Australia and Sydney in particular, which is just a delightful city to visit. But more than that, there are lots of exciting things going on here in terms of business and thinking about business. And so it's always nice for me to be exposed to the new ideas that are coming out from different parts of the world, especially Australia. So I want to warn you today that the topic I'm about to discuss is one that when I go in that direction, a lot of people tend to assume that I'm some sort of a communist. Nothing could be further from the truth. I adore business. I'm deeply attached to it. I do not believe that successful societies can exist without a thriving business sector. At the same time, I also understand that free market is an oxymoron. A free market is a place where the biggest, strongest person bops you over the head and takes what they want. Markets cannot exist without law, and business cannot exist without law. And in order to understand what makes business contribute to social welfare, because of course, in my view, that's what business is about. It's about improving our lives. And by the way, it's brilliant at that when it's structured properly. But it has to be structured properly, and to do that, we need to be very realistic and very informed about what business really is. And my thesis today is that collectively, we may have made a dreadful mistake over the past 20, 30 years in misunderstanding what business really is, and especially what the public corporation really is. And I want to give you an example, I think, of how that mistake has actually impeded the ability of business to make our lives better. And the example is BP. You probably remember that on April 20th in 2010, an oil well that BP was drilling in the Gulf of Mexico suddenly exploded. And the oil rig, the Deepwater Horizon, went up in a column of fire that burned for 2 days before it finally collapsed into the depths of the Gulf of Mexico, killing 11 people and beginning the worst oil spill in, I believe, the history of humanity. This was a disaster on a scale that's very hard to imagine. But it was especially a disaster for BP shareholders themselves. BP shares had been trading around $60 a share US before the Deepwater Horizon explosion, and within a month or so afterwards, they had been halved to $30 a share. A loss in BP's market capitalization of $100 billion. Of course, the calamity was by no means confined to reductions in the value of BP shares. BP bonds were also severely damaged as they were downgraded to almost junk bond status. Other oil companies' shares were harmed because in the wake of the spill, President Obama imposed a moratorium on all drilling in the Gulf, which of course is bad for all the other corporations that were seeking oil in the Gulf. It was bad for corporations that were in the tourism industry in the Gulf. It was bad for the fishing industry in the Gulf. It was bad for individuals who owned real estate in the area of the Gulf. It was bad for individuals who were employed in the fishing and the tourism industries in the Gulf. It was bad for people who like to eat fish from the Gulf. And it was bad for anyone who wanted to enjoy the recreational facilities of the Gulf ecosystem. And finally, it was obviously very bad for the Gulf ecosystem itself. How could a disaster happen on such a massive scale? The United States government organized a commission to investigate. And what they concluded was that the ultimate cause of the disaster was BP's desire to cut safety corners in order to save money. Each day that BP was drilling without putting the well into full operation was costing them $1 million. So in order to save $1 million a day, they ended up sacrificing $100 billion in shareholder wealth alone. No matter how you do the math, this was an enormous mistake. How could it have been made? My hypothesis is that one of the ultimate causes of the BP oil spill was what I call shareholder value thinking. And shareholder value thinking possesses the business world today, especially publicly listed companies. And it drives executives and directors to focus relentlessly on trying to get their share price up not 10 years from now, not even 5 years from now, 3 months from now, tomorrow, if possible. And in the quest to raise share price, we see companies do what BP did. They cut safety corners. They reduce workplace safety. They make other poor decisions. They cut back on customer support. They reduce expenditures on research and development. A consulting firm in the United States published the results of a survey last year in which they interviewed chief financial officers of listed companies and said, would you undertake an investment in a project that would produce net present value, positive net present value over 3 to 5 years if you thought it would harm your quarterly earnings? And 85% of the CFOs said no, we would not make that long-term investment if it harmed our short-term ability to meet our earnings estimates. Not only do companies resist long-term investments, they fail to take adequate care of their customers. They fail to take adequate care of and to invest in their employees. They take on risks, and we've certainly seen this in the U.S. financial sector. They leverage up their firms in the hopes that if things go well, they'll produce an enormous profit, and with the assurance that if things go very poorly indeed, much of the loss will be borne by their bondholders, by their customers, by their employees, but not ultimately by the shareholders themselves. Finally, in the U.S. in particular, in the quest to raise share price, they actually manipulate the law itself. There's a story that has not been told enough in the United States, I think, which is that in many ways we can trace the 2008 credit crisis to 2 changes in U.S. law that were driven by Enron and Citibank respectively. Citibank lobbied to eliminate restrictions on banks' abilities to speculate through proprietary trading divisions, and Enron lobbied to change the futures regulations laws so that for the first time in American business history, purely speculative futures trading off of an exchange became legal, and that was the origin of a $600 trillion derivatives market. So if we look at what this focus on share price has done, I think there's lots of reason to suspect it is actually preventing corporations from doing their best, not only for communities, for their employees, for their customers, but also possibly for investors as a class over time. So how did we get to shareholder value thinking? So this is really how I came to this project. I am a law professor. I study the law. And when I first went off teaching law, one of the things that drove me crazy was, of course, I, like probably virtually everyone in this room, had been taught that the purpose of the corporation is to maximize shareholder wealth, that shareholders are the ultimate owners of the corporation, and that ultimately they ought to exercise control. And if the boards of directors don't do what the shareholders want, then the shareholders ought to be able to step in and remove the boards. I mean, this was, as we say in America, mom, apple pie, and shareholder value. And I had no reason to doubt it when my professors taught it to me. It seemed sensible enough. Here's the problem. The more I taught law, the more I realized that's not what the law says. And indeed, 50 years ago, it's not what people in the business world believed. So let's step back in a time machine and go back to the 1940s and 1950s. If you were to interview the director of a public company in the 1940s or 1950s in America, and I can't speak for Australia, but certainly this would be true for the large public corporations there, the AT&Ts, the General Electrics, and you were to ask directors, what's the purpose of the corporation? They would have said something like, that's a very complicated question. We serve many different interests. We want to develop a large, successful firm, and that means we have to take care of our customers, we have to take care of our employees, we have to take care of our suppliers, we certainly have to take care of our investors, and we have to be good corporate citizens. Fast forward, get in your time machine, go to the year 2000, and if you were to ask most directors, they would say, oh no, we have one goal, maximizing shareholder wealth. How did that happen? It seems to have been the influence of an idea, or more specifically, an ideology, that as best I can trace it, came out of the University of Chicago in the 1970s and was led by, among others, the famed economist Milton Friedman. And there's this interesting intellectual history. It starts with Milton Friedman, who was a Nobel Prize-winning economist, but I'll tell you, was no lawyer, saying that shareholders own corporations. Now, how many people in the room are lawyers? I suspect we've got more than a few here. All right. Then please back me up on this. Shareholders don't own corporations. Corporations are independent legal entities that own themselves, just like you own yourself. What do shareholders own? Well, the name tells you. They own shares. And what is a share? It's a contract between the shareholder and the corporation that gives shareholders very limited rights. Just like bondholders enter a contract with the corporation that gives them limited rights, and employees enter contracts with corporations that give them limited rights. So from a legal perspective, Milton Friedman's claim that shareholders own corporations was wrong from the get-go. Yet, somehow this notion turned out to have tremendous appeal. It had tremendous appeal to economists because it gave them a simple story that also gave them a metric for measuring corporate performance. If you think that shareholders are the owners, or as more sophisticated economists would put it, the residual claimants, then you have an easily measurable corporate objective. The idea is, as long as you maximize the share value of the firm, you've maximized the social contributions that the firm makes. Because everyone else, according to economic theory, gets only what their contracts provide them. Bondholders get interest payments, employees get their salaries, but they're not entitled to, and they shouldn't receive anything else. Shareholders as owners should get every penny of profit that's left over after the firm has paid off the fixed claims of its other participants. And if you're an economist, you say, this is brilliant. All we have to do to make recommendations about the best way to govern firms is to figure out what you can do that can raise the share price at firms, and we've got ourselves a tidy little business in economic consulting. So the consultants, the economists and the economic consultants loved this idea, and business journalists and a lot of professors loved the idea too, because it makes corporations very easy to understand. It almost analogizes them to a sole proprietorship. And anyone can understand a sole proprietorship. So if you talk about corporations as if they're owned by shareholders, as if shareholders are the residual claimants, as if shareholders are principals who hire agents, then suddenly a very complex institution that I personally think of as being more comparable to a nation state suddenly gets reduced to something that you can explain in a paragraph to your students, to your readers if you're a journalist, to your business school students if you're a business school professor. The problem is, and this is what I found so frustrating when I began to teach, and to a more limited extent as a member of a board of trustees, which is the equivalent of a board of directors, I began to experience it in the business world. It simply didn't describe the reality that I saw. So what was the reality that I saw? Well, the first thing I've already mentioned, which is that as a legal matter, it is completely misleading to describe shareholders as owners of firms. They're not. They are people who enter contracts with firms, just as bondholders, employees, suppliers enter contracts with firms. What about this notion that shareholders are entitled to all the profits left over after other firm participants have been paid? Or, as an economist would put it, that shareholders are the residual claimants. Well, it turns out that's only an accurate description of dead firms that are being liquidated. It's not an accurate description of living firms at all. What happens in living firms? Well, actually, shareholders do not get a penny unless the directors decide to declare a dividend. They're not, in any realistic sense, entitled to take all of the profits. They have to wait for the directors to give it to them. Now, at this point, I always get a very sensible finance student who puts up her hand and says, oh, Professor Stout, but it doesn't matter if the directors don't declare dividends. As you may know, in the US, they frequently don't. Dividends are a much bigger part of business life in the UK and in Australia than they are in the States. But my students would say, it doesn't matter if the directors don't declare dividends, because, of course, then the earnings will be retained by the firm, and the value of the shares will rise. So at the end of the day, the shareholders get the benefit anyway. At which point I turn to my student and I say, very good, I'm glad you've taken finance. Now you need to go take an accounting course. Because if you take accounting, you'll very quickly learn that retained earnings is an accounting concept. And of course, earnings are nothing more than revenues minus expenses. Oh, and by the way, who controls the expenses? It's not the shareholders. It is, again, the board of directors. So there's only profits for the shareholders if the directors want there to be. And if instead, if the firm's got tons of revenues rolling in, and the directors say, but we want to give some of this money to the employees in the form of a raise, and we want to give our executives access to a Learjet. By the way, if you want, I'm perfectly happy to defend the executive jet to anyone. It's much cheaper than giving them stock options. Give them a jet if it makes them happy. And they even get more work done that way. So I don't understand this anti-jet thing, even though I myself fly coach. And I'm envious as the rest of you, but really, jets are not so bad. In any case, the directors can say, we're going to build up a cash cushion, which, by the way, benefits the creditors along with the shareholders. They say, we can donate money to the community. So what happens in reality in successful corporations is that when the corporation's doing very well, there are lots of groups that benefit along with shareholders. And by the way, when the corporation's doing poorly, there are lots of groups that have to bear the cost. So when you've got a bad year, you say, sorry, executives, the jet's gone, you're flying coach. You tell the employees, your health benefits are going to be cut back, no more dental insurance for you. You cut back on your philanthropic contributions, and the equity cushion gets worn thin, and the creditors suffer. That's the way living firms operate. I think it's a tremendous mistake to judge the role of shareholders by what happens in dead firms that are being liquidated. That's like judging the use of a horse by what happens to dead horses, right? Live horses are athletes and pets. Dead horses are pet food. Don't confuse the two functions. All right. And live corporations are different from dead corporations. So finally, let's get to this notion that is very common among economists, that shareholders are principals who control directors as their agents. Again, the lawyers in the room, this is legally completely wrong. In law, principals are people who want to accomplish something, who hire agents to do the job for them, subject to their control. Now, this is very interesting because it presumes that the principal comes before the agent, and it presumes that the principal controls the agent. That's not the way corporations come first. As a matter of law, the corporation and the board of directors appears long before there's a shareholder on the horizon. You have to incorporate the firm and you have to select a board of directors before there's anyone in position to enter a contract with shareholders and sell shares. How can you possibly have a principal that's created after the agent's created? It's the other way around. And of course, boards of directors are not controlled by shareholders in a typical publicly listed firm. Now, here I must mention that the arguments that I'm making apply primarily to publicly listed firms and not to privately listed firms with controlling shareholders. Firms with controlling shareholders, which are, of course, the model in most of the world, especially outside the United States, are quite a different animal. And in a sense, you can say that if you've got a controlling shareholder, you're moving closer to this notion of shareholder ownership, because that controlling shareholder has much more influence over the board through the power to remove them relatively easily. However, interestingly enough, the data shows that these privately managed or privately controlled firms actually, ironically, tend to make decisions that are more long-term and more socially responsible than the publicly listed firms. And I'm going to explain why in a few minutes. Now let's go back to these publicly listed firms where there's this enormous pressure that we're placing on directors, not coming from the law, but coming actually from our ideology of what we think directors should do. These enormous pressures to maximize shareholder value. Well, it turns out that that pressure has got no basis in corporate law itself. Because if you look at the rules of corporate law, although you can find dicta in some cases where judges have offhandedly said things like, oh, well, directors owe duty to shareholders, I can also show you plenty of cases that say directors also owe duties to this entity called the firm. And in the United States, I can give you cases that say, oh, and while they're looking after the firm, directors have the discretion to look after other constituencies, employees, suppliers, consumers. But the key point from a legal perspective is that this is all dicta, or as we legal types call it, mere dicta. Meaning, It's not binding in any way. In law, what matters is not dicta, not the offhand remark. In law, what matters is what we call the holding, what the judge makes you do at the end of the day. And in both the US and Australia, at the end of the day, judges don't make directors maximize shareholder value. Instead, they defer to something called the business judgment rule that says as long as directors are not using their powers to line their own pockets, as long as they're not stealing from the firm, it's up to the board to decide what the corporation ought to do. And this pattern, by the way, is reflected in corporate charters themselves. Another source of corporate law, in quotes, that I think is very neglected, is what the corporate charter says about corporate purpose. And in most states in the United States, there's actually a requirement that you describe the corporate purpose in the charter. I have never seen a charter that says the purpose of this corporation is to maximize shareholder value. It may exist out there, but after years of looking at charters, I've never seen it. What you do see over and over is the following. The purpose of the corporation is to do anything lawful. So both in the internal law of corporate charters and the external law of case law, what we see is that corporate law has evolved to preserve enormous discretion on the part of directors to choose purposes other than maximizing shareholder value. It is a mistaken view that many directors have, and I think we can attribute this view to, I do think we academics get much of the blame because since the days of Milton Friedman, we've been teaching our students in law schools and business schools that they need to maximize shareholder value. But that's not, in fact, what the law says. And it doesn't seem to be working out all that well. The more business goes in the direction of convincing our directors we need to maximize shareholder value, let's just say there's no evidence it's helping. When I'm feeling ambitious, I may go further and say, I can't prove it, but I suspect it's hurting. But let me talk about the evidence we've got. Because of this embrace of shareholder value thinking, we have a generation of economists and legal scholars who thought, well, this is a lovely theory. Let's go out and prove it's true. And boy, have they tried. They have tortured the data until it screamed. And yet, there is a remarkable lack of any reliable, replicated evidence that corporations that are run according to the principles of shareholder value actually produce better results for shareholders, never mind anybody else. So one of my favorite examples is in the United States, about, I think it's now 7 or 8% of firms have what we call dual class shares, where you've got the founders of the company who have one class of shares that have 10 times the voting power of the public shareholders. Now, if you believe in conventional shareholder primacy theory, you would say that's a dreadful situation because the 10% of the shareholders who control all the votes often tend to be the executives and the top managers of the corporation. You'd say that should be a dreadful system. They should produce dreadful returns for shareholders. Well, there's no evidence that that's true, and there's actually some evidence that firms that have dual class capitalization outperform firms with one share, one vote if you look at long-term results and if you look at their ability to avoid collapsing. Firms that have one share, one vote are more fragile and tend to run into trouble more often and also don't tend to have as good long-term operating results. But more broadly, I think that by looking at the performance of individual companies, we're actually looking at the wrong phenomenon. I call this the problem of fishing with dynamite. So let me give you an analogy. Suppose you wanted to figure out the best fishing technique. And you might go out and say, oh, there are fishermen who use bait, they use, I don't know, worms for bait. And there are fishermen who use lures for bait. And if we want to find out the best way to fish, what we're going to do is run an empirical study to see if you get more fish by fishing with worms or fishing with lures. And at first, that seems like a very sensible way to test what's the best way to fish, right? But what if one of the fishermen figures out that he can fish with dynamite? Well, what are your empirical studies going to show? They're going to show that anyone who switches from fishing to worms to fishing with dynamite gets lots more fish. And you're also going to see that the overall fish catch goes up dramatically in the short term. But what's going to happen to fishing in the long term? Well, we've tried this in lots of communities, and we know what tends to happen when you let people fish with dynamite is eventually you run out of fish. And my concern is that something very similar may be going on in the business world. By embracing the ideology of shareholder value and encouraging corporate directors and corporate executives to do something, anything, to raise share price at a particular firm tomorrow, we are actually making it harder and harder for the corporate sector as a whole to produce long-term returns for investors. And, you know, as I will be the first person to admit, there's no way I can prove that the dreadful returns that U.S. investors in particular have suffered in the last 10 years, which, by the way, we now call the lost decade in the United States. Investor returns have been almost flat. I can't prove that shareholder value thinking is a direct cause because there's so many other possible causes, but the logical connection is there. If the short-term pursuit of a higher share price harms long-term returns, both for the shareholders of that company and for the shareholders of other companies, and for the economy as a whole, you would expect to see what we have seen, which is that the increasing embrace of shareholder thinking, especially as reflected in executive compensation plans, has produced a flattening of economic growth, investment, and shareholder returns along with it. All right. So where do we stand intellectually? Where we stand intellectually, oh my gosh, I'm almost done. How did that happen? All right. I'm going to leap to the chase. I've done the most important part. Where we stand intellectually, I think, is it's time for us as people who believe in business to sit back and say, we believe in business, but we also believe in reality. And if we look at the reality, our theories of what makes business work don't seem to be working. There's something wrong with the theory. We need a new theory. Well, I was going to spend a lot of time talking about possible new theories, but I see I've run out of time. But I'll just hint at the one I think I have found a useful wedge to get people started thinking. And that is, why is shareholder value going wrong? My working hypothesis is we don't understand what shareholders are. Shareholder is a fiction. I actually have a reverse view. A lot of people think that corporations are fictions and shareholders are real. I think that's backwards. Corporations are real. They may be invisible, but any lawyer will tell you, as legal entities, they're very real. They own property, they commit torts, they enter contracts. The shareholder is a fiction. Shareholders are human beings. The idea that there's some mythical shareholder there that cares only about the price of Qantas stock and nothing else is a mistake. Hedge fund managers come close, but the rest of us have lots of interests. And they include, we're not just interested in what happens to Qantas stock tomorrow. We're interested in what happens to Qantas stock 10 years from now, because if you're saving for retirement, if it's your super, I guess you call it here, it's that long term you're thinking about. We're not just interested in Qantas's ability to get a short-term rise in share price by pressing down wages. We're also interested in making sure that Qantas has a good, positive, long-term relationship with labor. Now, it may be labor in another part of the world, but if you're interested in Qantas's long-term success and in the success of other businesses, you need to keep labor and suppliers and other constituencies at the table contributing to firms. We're interested not just in the price of Qantas stock, but if you're a diversified shareholder, you care about all the other Australian firms whose businesses were disrupted when Qantas stopped flying. So Qantas stock went up and everybody else's stock went down because their business executives couldn't get where they were going and their supplies and their products couldn't get where they were going. And finally, and I love this part, if you want to talk about this, I'd be delighted to talk about this. Another area that I do research in is moral behavior. And as you may have gathered, I actually think successful business and moral behavior are deeply related. And in my study of moral behavior, I have good news for you. Most of us aren't psychopaths. Because, of course, Homo economicus is. The rare entity that truly cares about nothing but his or her own material gain is technically called a psychopath. And I'm pleased to report that most of us actually would prefer to get slightly reduced shareholder returns as, say, shareholders of Union Carbide, if our companies would avoid blowing up an Indian village and killing 2,000 and maiming 10,000 more. So the reality is, if you look at the data, there's every reason to think that shareholders, as human beings, also want their corporations to be socially responsible. But that's not something shareholders can do. That's not something corporations can do when you relentlessly press them to raise share price at any cost. Okay, have I caused enough trouble, Justin? I hope so. But I think I'll simply close by saying, I think the moral of the story is that ideas matter. And John Maynard Keynes actually told us about this many years ago, where he wrote that practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. I fear we have allowed ourselves, and by ourselves I mean the business community, the investing community, and the community, to become slaves of a defunct economic idea that it's well past time to revisit. So thank you very much.